our next speaker, Dr. Mario Ordaz, researcher at the Engineering Institute at UNAM, who will also talk about the risk mitigation due to natural phenomena and pending tasks. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you for your time. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Gabriela. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank by thanking Dr. Alcocer for the invitation to participate in this interesting event. We have seen very impressive research on the resilience of schools.
Entonces, ¿sí ven ya mi pantalla, perdón?
Can you see my screen?
Sí la vemos, doctor. Aunque no la vemos todavía en el formato de presentación,
though it's
pero ya
not
está su
in
pantalla.
presentation mode.
Espérame. Entonces, ¿qué tal ahí?
What about now?
Seguimos viéndola igual, doctor. Ahí ya la estamos viendo en PowerPoint, ya nada más la pone en presentación. Por favor.
Sí.
Adelante.
Adelante. Bueno, sí, muchas gracias. Yo voy a
Yes,
hablar sobre
I am going to be
las que
talking
me parece que son unas tareas
about some of the tasks that are still pending, in my opinion,
complejo
in this complex and great
de
purpose of
reforzamiento intervención de las escuelas.
reinforcing and intervening schools. We have seen that this is a very big issue, as Engineer Fernando Ramirez mentioned, and throughout this workshop, we have heard from different international experiences proposing the intervention of schools, which inspire us. And I think we've seen that technical aspects regarding the performance of schools in earthquakes and possible strategies to reconstruct and reinforce them are well understood in our community. But I think that we need to now start to think about how to plan, design, and execute these mitigation activities, which we know are the only thing that can reduce risks. We need to talk about them, and of course, making studies about them does not reduce risk, but the only thing that does are intervention activities. And in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the tasks that are pending. There are many. We've seen that this is a very complex issue, and as people say, any issue, no matter how dire it is usually more complicated than we initially think. And I'm going to be stressing 3 tasks that I think are still pending, related to the need to quantitatively evaluate the risk in order to take good decisions. I'm going to follow up some of the things included in Fernando Ramirez's presentation, whose study is something that is still pending as well. We're talking about long-term tasks. Some might or should be permanent, and they are not necessarily linked to emergency reconstructions after events like the 2017 earthquake. These planning activities should be permanent and must be executed constantly. The tasks that, in my opinion, are still pending,
bueno, unas de las que están pendientes y sobre las
at
que
least some of
hablaremos
them,
hoy son estas.
but the ones that I'm
Primero,
going to be talking about today are
pues
these.
cómo hacer para priorizar
How,
las actividades de refuerzo y reconstrucción
what we
en
need to
vista
do
de
to
que pues, no vamos a poder
prioritize reinforcement and
implementarlo al mismo
reconstruction
tiempo.
activities, because
Y
we're not going to
aquí
be
les
able
voy
to
a
do
continuar
everything at the same
las
time.
ideas
I'm going
de
to
Fernando Ramírez y también a dar algunos detalles sobre cómo
follow up some of
podríamos
the ideas
hacerlo
shared by
en
Fernando
función de estos.
Ramirez, and
Después voy a hablar sobre una
also
idea
I'm going to
que
be talking about
ha estado en la mesa desde hace mucho tiempo
something that
entre
has
las
been on the
personas que
table
nos
for
dedicamos al
quite a
análisis
while,
de riesgos y al análisis
discussed
de desastres,
by
que
the
es si
people
la
who
necesidad de
handle
incluir
risk
en las construcciones nuevas
management,
consideraciones de
the
riesgo,
need to
quizá
include
por la vía de
risk
incluir el costo de
considerations
la
in
reconstrucción
new buildings
como un condicionante de
and
diseño.
future costs
Eh,
as
este es algo que normalmente no
part
se
of the
hace,
initial
pero que
design. This
debería
is
hacerse.
something that is not done, but
Y
I believe
la tercera
should
tarea
be done.
pendiente
And the third
que
pending
me parece
task
importante que deberíamos
that I
impulsar
think is
con más puntería
important
es en cómo financiar
is how to
cierta
finance
parte de las actividades de
a
mitigación.
certain
Entonces voy
portion
a
of the
hablar de
mitigation
estas tres
activities.
cosas
So I'm going to be talking about these three
que me parece
things,
que son interesantes
which I think are
y tienen que ver con
interesting
el tipo de trabajo que yo hago.
and
Ahora,
relate to
entonces
the type of
empecemos
work that I do.
con
Let's start with
la priorización de las actividades de
the
intervención. Seguramente no vamos a poder
prioritization of
reforzar todas las escuelas al
mitigation
mismo tiempo,
planning.
no
We
tenemos
won't be able to reinforce
personas lo
all schools at the same
suficientemente
time. We
expertas.
don't have
Y
enough
entonces
people
uno
or enough money.
debería preguntarse por dónde
So we
empezamos
must ask
el
ourselves,
refuerzo.
where do we start?
Estoy pensando en que ya reforzamos las escuelas que están evidentemente dañadas.
I'm
Y
thinking
entonces,
that we evidently
¿por dónde
must
empezamos este programa
reinforce the damaged
de
schools,
refuerzo?
but how
Y
can we
nos
start
preguntemos
this
por dónde
reinforcement
empezamos y cuánto
program
invertimos
and how much we invest
en estas actividades.
in these
Em,
activities?
La respuesta a la segunda pregunta
The answer
parecería
to
ser
the
una respuesta
second
exclusivamente
question
administrativa y obvia.
might
¿Cuánto
seem too
invertimos? Pues
administrative
cuánto
or
podemos,
obvious.
pero
How much do we invest?
no es
As
tan
much as we
obvia
have, but it's not that obvious,
esa respuesta sea suficiente, ¿no? O sea, ¿cuánto
and it's
invertimos? Quiere decir
not
cómo
enough.
distribuimos la
How
inversión
and how much we
varios
invest
niños. Vamos a
means
ver
how do we distribute
cómo le podemos entrar
and
a esto.
allocate the resources
Desde
into
luego,
different
hay muchos
things.
posibles criterios para decidir
Of
cuáles
course, there are
son las
many
escuelas que
possible
van primero,
criteria to
pues las que
decide
están
which schools
evidentemente
go
dañadas,
first.
si es que
Evidently,
lograr
the ones that are
es un criterio.
visibly
Pero si
damaged,
vamos
that's
desde el
a
punto de vista de
criteria.
utilidad social,
And from
pues va a
the point
convenir
of view
reforzar
of
primero las
its
escuelas
social
cuya importancia
usefulness,
monetaria sea mayor
we
o que
ought
tengan más
to
alumnos. Puede haber
reinforce
muchos
the
criterios
questions that
de este tipo. Aquí
have the
yo
most
solo hago
students, criteria like that.
sobre los
I'm going to be talking
criterios que
about
están relacionados con la
the
mitigación de
criteria
riesgos. O
related
sea,
to risk mitigation,
no con otros criterios y
not
estoy consciente de que en
other
muchos casos
criteria.
la decisión, podríamos
I
tomar
am
otros criterios
aware
que no son
that
estos,
the
relacionados con la
decision to
mitigación de los riesgos,
prioritize
pero me parece que
is
de cualquier
informed by
manera
other
deberíamos
criteria, but in my
pensar sobre
opinion,
ello.
we should be
Entonces,
thinking
como decía
about
Fernando,
risk mitigation as well.
es ideal empezar
As
por las
Fernando
escuelas
mentioned,
en
it
que se redujera el
would,
riesgo lo
for
más
starters,
posible por cada peso invertido
seem ideal
en
to start in
reconstrucción. Es decir,
schools that would reduce
sería
the
ideal empezar por las escuelas con la
most,
mayor relación esperada beneficio-costo.
the ones that have more
No hay duda sobre cómo medir el
cost
costo, o sea,
benefit, and
el
there's
costo de la
no way
intervención es algo
to measure
relativamente
the
fácil de calcular,
cost of the
pero ahora
intervention.
nos preguntamos cómo medimos el
But how
beneficio.
do we measure
O
the
sea,
benefit?
pues sí, reforzar una escuela seguramente tiene
To
beneficio, pero
reinforce a school for sure is
traducir eso en
beneficial,
números.
but can we
Podemos
translate that into numbers?
encontrar indicadores
Can we
cuantitativos de
find
cuál es ese
quantitative
beneficio.
indicators to
Sí,
amount
la
to that
respuesta es que
benefit?
sí.
Yes,
Hay diferentes maneras posibles de hacer esto
there are
y vamos
therefore
a ver una
different ways to do
que es muy
this, and we're going
sencilla
to
o
see
que, bueno,
one that is
más que es
quite simple.
sencilla, es una manera de simplificar un
Rather than
problema de
simple,
muchas
it's a way to
aristas muy
simplify
complicada, pero vamos a ver
a complicated
cómo se le
problem.
podría entrar
And
desde el punto de vista del análisis de riesgo. Empezamos
I'm
con
going to
las
show it to you.
curvas de riesgo, que son unas
Let's
curvas
start with
que
risk
se usan para
curves.
describir el perfil de
to describe the risk profile of a school or group of schools or schools in a state or municipality, curves in which we have values for loss expressed as a fraction of the total cost to reconstruct. And in the vertical axis, we have the exceedance rates. How frequent earthquakes or hurricanes or mudslides occur. These are the curves that help us measure the risk of our assets. And this could be the risk profile of a school or group of schools before being reinforced. This is the current situation. And once we reinforce them with certain criteria, for sure, the risk in this curve will decrease and the curve will go from red to green, and we will reduce the risk. And we can prove that this area between both curves, which is measured in pesos per year, is an indicator. It's the change of the estimated yearly loss before the reinforcement and after the reinforcement. The area below this curve indicates the measured benefit in these terms, how much we have reduced the annual estimated loss in these schools by intervening the schools. Of course, other interventions, other measures would cause the movement of the curve to be different and different results in terms of the annual estimated loss, which is in blue. Now, we have loss as one of the axes. Depending on the terms we want to describe this in. Now, Dr. Fernando Ramirez mentioned reduction of the loss of human life as a result of intervention. And we can have those amounts there. And so the blue area would be the reduction of the annual expected number of victims in a specific school or group of schools. So it could be that, it could also be physical loss to amount to the losses that are financial or loss of service or a combination thereof. The analyst would define this, and a way to measure the cost benefit ratio could be this one, which is the cost benefit ratio, which is the quotient between the reduction of annual estimated losses divided by the cost of intervention. So what we reduce in terms of losses divided by what we invest in reinforcing the schools. This criteria could help us both to prioritize the reinforcement by geographical area. It could point to where we need to start, either Guerrero State or Michoacan State, but it would also help us prioritize by type of intervention, and it would also point out the intervention optimal amounts. The intervention amounts usually have a decreasing marginal performance. The first investments reduce risk more than the later investments. And so we now have a tool, but you might wonder, how can I get these curves from? And well, the second point that we need to bring to the table and some of the things that must condition the financing planning activities is the cost of future losses. When we determine the feasibility of a public construction, we usually include the initial construction costs and at times the current amount for maintenance, especially if we're talking about a productive construction. But very rarely or ever, we include among the feasibility costs the cost for future losses, which exist, they are real, but they are a contingent liability. This is a debt that the owner has, and he or she is going to pay that debt, but he or she doesn't know when. And so we never take into account this into the decision. A design decision has an impact on, of course, the construction, but also on future losses. It is clear that the financial feasibility of a school building is not the central element in the decision to build it or not, but if we explicitly include the cost of future losses in the decision, this process can lead to less risky buildings and constructions. Taking this into account usually leads to structures that are more resistant than the contrary. Why? Well, this is a theoretical concept that has been formalized at times and can help our decision taking. In the classical design decision, we have contradictory factors. For starters, we have the initial construction cost, current costs that grow in green. The greater the lateral resistance or the design is, the cost will also grow. And sometimes these decisions are limited by the money we have. But these are not the only factors that impact the decision. We also have the expected losses due to natural disasters. And these losses can be seen in the blue curve, which are decreasing in terms of the design value. The greater the design cost is, the less the expected losses will be because of any danger that might happen. Usually, a decision that, let me just simplify this, a decision that does not take into account the expected losses would probably take us to have a cost and design value amounting to the circle that just appear there. But once we include the expected losses, it's very likely that the expected losses will be so high with less value of design, then we would have to have our addition of the future and current losses. So if we include the cost of future losses in the value of design, we will have lesser expected costs because we would be reducing the expected losses. I think that this is a planning practice that must be considered in construction decision taking for schools. How do we assess the future costs? Well, this is a complex topic. The analysis of the behavior of structures and how we translate that into losses is very complex.
And this is something we're going to have in Dr. Ayala's presentation. Some are atypical cases. How can we calculate future costs? You would say, well, they cannot be calculated. We do have some insights on this. Future costs cannot always be random costs, although they do have some random characteristics. There are things we can use to calculate. Future losses can be calculated with this equation. This is future loss calculation, CPF by its Spanish acronym. Well, this is a function which is a decreasing function, and this is the expected annual loss that depends on the level of the selected design. And it is the discount rate of losses that take place in the future. How can we transform this and the present value? The expectancy data is, this is the number of transactions. If it were a different type of transaction, expected losses of human lives. But if it's financial losses, tell us that the present value of future losses 20 years a year. This is the type of loss, and we should be adding construction and maintenance costs. And surely, by adding these numbers, we would make more conservative decisions in terms of construction and design. So this is another tool. I'm not going to go into budgetary aspects that are so necessary for reinforcement activities and also for reconstruction activities. But let me say something on certain financing issues. As I've said, this doesn't include budgetary aspects. Let me just discuss one part of the financing process, because we know that reinforcement activities will take years. This is not done overnight, and throughout that time, throughout those years, natural events will continue, of course, like earthquakes. I think it's also a pending task for us to reflect on how are we going to be paying for things that happen while we are doing the other activities. So how do we go about financing these losses? In other words, we should be thinking about the transferring of the financial risk, which is so necessary for all the mitigation activities to be sustainable, for us not to be going through many surprises in this process. So risk transfers should not be seen as an instrument for the owners of buildings to increase value of their assets. And this, of course, should be seen as an instrument to stabilize erratic cash flows or payment flows that governments will have to cover in the face of natural disasters, with losses, of course. And this has to do with payment flows. And I'm talking about the natural flow of payments due to disasters. And we know that this is almost impossible to manage. So then, that's why the risk transfer activities are good to stabilize those payment flows so that construction activities may be implemented without surprises. What about losses by event? That is, what losses does each one of those events imply? Catastrophic events, that is. This is a random chart in terms of time and dimension. It's very difficult to manage this payment flow. There might be catastrophes resulting in losses that are completely unexpected, hundreds or tens of thousands of dollars that are necessary to pay for those unexpected events. Even if we do not know the exact size and the time in which those disasters will be taking place, we can calculate this amount, which is the expected annual loss, PAE by its Spanish acronym. And this is the sum of all losses in 2,500 years, divided into 2,500 years. This is the slope here. Those activities have the objective of substituting the loss for different events and then accumulated losses, which is the red. Essentially, this could be a budgetary item, whereas the green one, it is impossible to manage the one in green. Right now, we have a lot of instruments that governments use for their financial transfers in cases of risk events or hazardous events. This is the classical one for risk transfers. Each instrument has a place in risk transfer strategies for each country. There are certain standards, as for instance, ILS, the insurance-linked securities. How do governments decide resource distribution among the different available instruments? We have an IDB project with tools to do financial cost transfers among different available instruments, looking into marginal cost and other risk transfer instruments to maximize risk transfers. Lately, we have seen various market methodological developments of the parametric insurance of the World Bank, where indemnifications take place not as a consequence of loss adjustment, but as a consequence of certain indexes taking into account predetermined values. So there's a very big variety and range of instruments of this type that governments are now using. There are many types of parametric insurance that are now being used very actively. The first generation is called cat in a box. This is for catastrophic bonds, and there are more that are even more advanced. This is just the first generation. And there's some advantages here in terms of the speed in which the payment is made. We have fast payment, quick payments. So this is a very appropriate instrument for emergency operations. And the moral risk between the insured and the insurance company, this is something that's being eliminated through this process. The disadvantage is the index for this parametric insurance is not directly related to losses, so there might be insufficient payments for any type of event. This is base risk that can be measured to minimize this type of risk. This is another pending task we should be reflecting on. We should also be doing things to transfer risks and prioritize reinforcement and reconstruction activities. These are some of the pending questions. Will it be necessary for us to have a detailed risk analysis for each one of the schools? I don't think so. But if it were necessary, the Mexican government, thanks to Fonden information, already has all the necessary data on the physical characteristics of the schools. So this risk analysis can be implemented. We should be applying science and techniques for this analysis for us to be making the best decisions we might be making facing this gigantic task. I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Yes, thank you, Mario Ordaz. Thank you so much for your expose, for your excellent presentation. We're now looking into the need of different types of interventions in cities, territories subject to natural disasters. Prompt decisions that are well informed are of the utmost importance. And this is, of course, also very important for the use of resources we're going to be making. We've had excellent presentations today, facing the future through mathematical models, looking into possibilities for the best type of safety with the best informed data.